He could hear screaming and people would be running in the crowd. He didn't know what to do and he would just keep following the noise. He would crawl up a building and he could see that somebody was on the ground. It couldn't be. Harry was in complete shock until he saw it was Peter's Uncle Ben. Peter would be crying, asking for help, screaming for help. Uncle Ben would take Peter's hand and Uncle Ben would die in Peter's hand. MJ would try holding Peter and Peter would be shouting, telling her to let go, and she would have tears in her eyes. Harry would be watching from a distance and the cop would say that they found the stolen car on 5th Avenue. Harry knew that he had to take action now and that this man was going to be brought dead or alive. He was doing this for Peter. He had to do this for Peter. The guy that was robbed with the cash would run down the street telling the cops what just happened, and he would tell the cops that Spider-Man could have stopped him but he didn't, and that he just let him run free. Peter couldn't even believe that he heard this. He was screaming. MJ would scream at Peter and Peter would run off into an alleyway. Harry would swing, already having a little bit of experience, and Harry would chase the robber down and he would go on top of the car and Harry would use his webs on one of the wheels, making the car go flying. It would roll out of control. The car would roll over and the burglar would run into the building in time. Peter would smash into a car windshield and he would drive off with it. He would make it there in time, but he would see Spider-Man and a broken window. He would yell at Spider-Man and he would scream, saying that he killed his Uncle Ben. Peter would charge at him, but Spider-Man would dodge the attack and Peter would almost go flying into a wall. Harry would look at Peter and he would swing out of the building. Peter could see that cops were coming and he would book it out of the building as fast as possible. Harry would go on top of the building, thinking of everything that just happened. He failed his friends by trying to be selfish, and now he killed someone. He knew it wasn't his fault, but he was worried about Peter. He knew his Uncle Ben was dead, and he didn't know what to do. We would cut to Norman Osborn, and he would blow up the same area as he did, like the original timeline, and he would go to Quest Aerospace, stealing all of the rest of the equipment, like pumpkin bombs and other things, and Harry would swing home in disappointment. Harry would phone Peter, and Peter wouldn't want to talk about what happened, and he told him that he would meet him at the graduation sometime soon. Peter would blame Spider-Man for not saving Uncle Ben, and this would affect Peter in the future for this fan fiction. Peter would tell Aunt May what happened and how Spider-Man let the robber get away, and Peter would yell, saying that if he only would have stopped him, Uncle Ben would still be alive. Peter would break up with MJ, and Peter would tell MJ that he had to take time off from the relationship and that he had to get alone time. She would understand and she would feel bad for Peter. Well, she was there witnessing the entire thing happening. And Harry would distance himself from Peter for a bit, feeling a lot of guilt, and he knows it was all his fault for letting Peter's uncle get shot and killed in cold blood. Harry knew before the grad that Peter could never know that he was Spider-Man, and he promised he would never let that happen ever again. Harry would become the hero, and after the graduation events, everything would almost play out the same, but this time, Harry would create the Alex Ross gray and black concept suit, and he would swing into New York into his new colors. Norman would offer Peter a job during the graduation, and he would hire him on the spot in front of Harry. In this timeline, we now have Peter Parker working for Oscorp. Mary Jane would see Harry after the graduation was over, and she would ask him if maybe he wanted to go out for dinner or just go out, and Harry would smile, but he would tell her that she was already going out with Peter and that he didn't want to butt in. She would say that she was getting lonely, but Harry would raise his voice saying she was with Peter and that she made her choice. She would have a tear in her eye and she would walk away. Harry would go to New York just like the montage scene, stopping his first crime busts, and Harry would beat the crap out of thugs. The city was starting to know more about Spider-Man, and Peter had a hatred for this. He knew it was the same guy on that fateful day that let Uncle Ben get killed in cold blood, and he could never forgive Spider-Man for that. Spider-Man would take out criminals like Shocker, and he would be more aggressive, having a more aggressive fighting style, and he would even go right into the fight, just knocking criminals out and just destroying them instantly. Norman would invite Peter to go to the expo, and during this time, Peter and MJ would get back together. Norman would tell Harry also to go to the expo, and all three of them would be on top of that building, just like the original timeline. So this time, it's Harry Osborn, Peter, and MJ, and the party was going well, and Norman's plan was playing out just fine. It was time to unleash hell on the city. Peter would point at the sky in the distance. It was something flying, and he would tell Harry and MJ that it looked like it was the stolen glider and suit that Norman Osborn had told him days earlier, and he couldn't even believe his eyes. Green Goblin would throw 2 pumpkin bombs into the building, and Harry would grab MJ, and he would save both Peter and MJ. Harry knew if he got caught into to the explosion, his suit would get torn up and he might be exposed as Spider-Man. Harry would scream and his spider sense would go off, and Green Goblin would start laughing and he would look around at MJ. Peter would try doing something and Harry would tell him no, but Goblin would punch him right in the face and Peter would fall back to the ground knocked out. Green Goblin would blow up the board members and Harry would run out of the area getting his suit on, and he would save Peter and MJ. Spider-Man would web zip and he would catch Green Goblin's left shoulder with a web, using his weight to propel him, and he would go super fast in the air, punching Green Goblin off of his glider and he would fall off. Green Goblin would laugh and throw a pumpkin bomb at Spider-Man and it would blow up, destroying half of the building. Spider-Man would see a massive boulder about to crush people from down below, but he would use his webs in time with all of his strength and he would stop it from happening. Everybody would clap. Green Goblin would crawl up, getting back onto his feet, and he would get to the glider in time. He would grab MJ, she would start screaming, trying to break free, and Harry would yell, telling the Green Goblin to let her go, and he would. Spider-Man would run in time, catching her in the air, and Green Goblin would fly away, telling him that they would meet again, Spider-Man. Spider-Man would drop off MJ, and she would say, like the original timeline, who he was, and Spider-Man would say, "Your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man," and he would swing away. MJ knew Spider-Man, if it was the same one the night Uncle Ben died, maybe he had a heart, and saving all those people off of the building, MJ's faith in Spider-Man would be restored because of the events at the expo. Harry would swing through the city, stopping more crime, and he would see a Daily Bugle newspaper saying Menace. He would take his mask off, looking at it, and he would pick it up, seeing the picture was taken by Eddie Brock. Harry would rip the paper in half, knowing he had to pay a little visit to Jameson one day. Peter would go back to the Osborn residence house, and he would be suffering from a concussion. Norman would run into the room seeing Peter, and he would ask him what happened and what was going on. Peter would tell Norman what happened about the expo, telling him that somebody was in the same suit and glider that you were talking about earlier. Norman would look around and he would slowly smile. Norman would tell Peter there was nothing that they could do and that he should focus more on his work and stop focusing on girls and other things like the Green Goblin. He would tell Peter that MJ was using him and that she couldn't be trusted. He would go on saying that, "I got a job for you. You are to meet Otto Octavius and work for him on a brand new energy project." Peter would be shocked knowing Otto was a brilliant and great person. Norman would say in a few weeks he would meet him, but for now he has to keep studying and focusing on his future. Norman would tell Peter that he had to leave, and Peter would look at his phone knowing it was time to leave MJ, and he would phone her telling her it was time for him to move on and go back into the big city, and that he had more important work to do instead of having girls around the room. She would get mad and hang up the phone. Norman would go back into the other room and he would have a deranged smile. He would laugh knowing Peter did the right thing. Norman knew that he had to find out who Spider-Man was, and he knew what was he going to do next. He would look at the paper, and the paper would say Spider-Man Menace, and it would have a picture of him and the Green Goblin fighting on it. He would look at the picture and it would say picture taken by Eddie Brock, and then Norman Osborn would smile. Harry would go to the Daily Bugle as Spider-Man. He would crawl up the wall from the other side of the building. Green Goblin would shoot off into the sky laughing, knowing what he was going to do. He was going to find out the truth very, very soon. J. Jonah Jameson would be talking to Eddie about the pictures, telling him that these pictures of Spider-Man were crap, they weren't clear, and they were no good. Eddie would be confused and he would be pointing at the window, and J. Jonah Jameson would look around telling him what was he pointing at, and Green Goblin would be hovering from his glider, and Jonah would turn his seat around and Green Goblin would laugh, breaking into the building. Green Goblin would land his glider and Jonah would tell Eddie to call 911 as soon as possible, and Green Goblin would look, shoving J. Jonah Jameson out of the way. He would pick up Eddie by his shirt, demanding answers. Green Goblin would demand, saying nobody can take perfect shots of Spider-Man from these kind of conditions. He would tell Eddie he did his research, and J. Jonah Jameson would shout at Green Goblin, telling him he doesn't know what he's talking about and that they don't work with Spider-Man or have any information on him. Green Goblin would say useless, and right before he was about to crush Eddie's throat, Spider-Man would shoot a web at Green Goblin's hand, pulling him off of Eddie, and he would kick him to the ground. Eddie would drop to the ground. J. Jonah Jameson would point at Spider-Man, telling him that he was working together with the Green Goblin, and Spider-Man would laugh at J. Jonah Jameson, asking if he was serious. He just saved him from this guy, and now J. Jonah Jameson would be yelling at Eddie to get his camera, but Spider-Man would take the camera and smash it, and Spider-Man would web Eddie up to the wall and tell J. Jonah Jameson he was going to deal with him later. Green Goblin would crawl up, getting back up, and he would try stabbing Spider-Man in the left shoulder. He actually would stab him in the shoulder, and Spider-Man would take Green Goblin by the arm, throwing him to the ground, but Green Goblin would kick Spider-Man in the chest, and he would be sent flying, smashing out of the Daily Bugle window. Spider-Man would use his webs in time, just catching another part of the building, and he would smash into it. Green Goblin would jump on his glider following him. Green Goblin would use knives from the glider, and he would chase Spider-Man in the building. Spider-Man would dodge it, doing a backflip, and Green Goblin would lose control from the glider, but he would use smoke, and it would go towards Spider-Man. Spider-Man would try crawling, trying to get to his feet, but Green Goblin would punch him back in the face 3 times, and he would be knocked out. Spider-Man would wake up almost like the original timeline, and Green Goblin would throw out the offer, telling him he should join him, and together they can take whatever they want when they want. Spider-Man would tell him that he was nuts and that he would never join him. Green Goblin would say that he would give him time to think about it, and if he thinks wrong, he's going to come for him and come for everybody he knows. Green Goblin would finally put his hand out to Spider-Man, and Spider-Man would just look at the Green Goblin, and Green Goblin would laugh and he would leave on his glider. Harry would get up from the ground and he would look around, knowing maybe the Green Goblin was right. Maybe these powers aren't meant to help others. Maybe he knew something else was here. Maybe he had to do other things, maybe criminal activity. He just didn't know what his abilities were for. He didn't know what to do. He would hear a scream in the distance and he knew that voice. It couldn't be. There would be a group of thugs in an alleyway and they would slap Mary Jane, kicking her to the ground. One of the thugs would point a gun directly at her face, but they would see somebody in the rain. The streetlight would flicker, casting shadows of somewhere. The thugs would scream, telling the person to show themselves, and Spider-Man would come out of the corner. He would wrap his hand around one of the thugs, telling the other thugs that it was going to be okay. Spider-Man would push him, punching him in the face, and he would be kicked to the ground, knocked out cold. The other thugs would try shooting Spider-Man, but he would be too fast, and he would pick up one of the unconscious thugs and throw him onto the other 2. They would fall back to the ground, and Spider-Man would take one by the arm, breaking his arm, and he would punch him in the face until it was all over. The other thug would crawl, trying to get to his feet, but Spider-Man would step on his hand, crushing it. He would pick him up by his back, and he would do a backbreaker, finishing the job. MJ would be scared, and Spider-Man would shout, telling her why she was here out so late at night. She would tell Spider-Man if he was following her, and he would go on, saying, I guess it's just at the right place at the right time. Spider-Man would get out of the shadows, and MJ would see him. MJ would tell Spider-Man it was his friend Peter. They broke up, and she had to be alone for a bit. She was walking down an alleyway until 3 people jumped her. Spider-Man would tell her that he was sorry to hear that, and he would start crawling up the wall. She would tell him to wait, just like the original timeline, and they would kiss, but in this timeline, it would be Harry and MJ kissing and not Peter. Spider-Man would crawl up the wall, knowing if he did the right thing. First it's Peter's uncle, and now he's taking MJ from him. He would take his mask off, knowing he couldn't be with MJ, and it was too late for that. Harry would come home almost beaten up, and Norman would tell him where the heck he was all afternoon and evening, and he would say that he was busy with friends. Norman would tell Harry Peter's aunt invited them to Thanksgiving dinner, and Harry would say that he would be there. Harry would tell his dad it was a long day and that he was going to crash. Harry would be swinging around as Spider-Man, and he would come across a burning building. He would jump into action, jumping into the building just like the original timeline. Green Goblin would yell, telling Spider-Man what about his offer? Was he in or was he out? Harry would get sick of seeing Green Goblin, and he would tell him that he was out of his mind, and Norman would throw those pumpkin bomb knives in the air, and Spider-Man would dodge all of them, almost missing them all except for one. He would be cut in the wrist, and the building would collapse. Norman would smile, saying, no one says no to me, not ever and not starting now. Harry would be shocked, and he would look at his hand and his wrist, and he would look at the time, knowing there wasn't going to be a lot of time to cover this up. He would go straight to Aunt May's house, and Harry would see Peter and Norman talking about the Oscorp Energy Project. Aunt May would walk up to Harry, telling him if he was okay and that he was cut. Norman would look at the cut, and he would look at Harry, telling him what happened. Harry would say that he was knocked down before he ended up getting here, and he ended up getting back up, and he could see that he was bleeding. He would try to wave it off, telling Aunt May and his dad that it was going to be okay. Norman, in the back of his head, knew the truth right then and there, and he was shocked. He would get up from the seat, and he would tell Peter and Aunt May that he had something to do at work, and that something happened, and that he had to leave as soon as possible. Harry would yell at his dad, saying his work is always more important than family and friends, and Peter would even look at Norman, and he would tell him that he could probably deal with the situation, and Norman would yell, saying that he had to do it, and he would slam the door. Norman would have a breakdown, knowing what could he do. His son was Spider-Man. There was nothing he could threaten Harry with. He knew that he had to get his son on his side, and he had to do it no matter what the cost. He would look at his goblin mask, and he would smile. Harry would thank Aunt May and Peter for the dinner, and he would apologize about his father, and Peter would interrupt him, saying he doesn't know what's been going on. Norman's been really stressed out at work, and that maybe it's come down to this. He would put his hand on Harry, and Harry would tell Peter that he had to go, out, and Peter would demand, wanting to know where he goes all the time, and he would be joking around asking if he had a girlfriend, and Harry would laugh, saying it was just something that was coming up. He would shut the door and Peter would look around to see, but Harry was gone. Norman would put a suit on, knowing what he had to do and what he was going to do. He was going to lure Harry to him and get him on his side. He would get his glider and he would go to the Parker residence house. Norman would go at nighttime and he would smash into the house looking at Aunt May screaming. Peter would rush into the room with a bat and Green Goblin would be laughing. Peter would swing the bat and Green Goblin would be hit in the face and he would go off of his glider slowly. He would punch Peter in the gut and he would fall to the ground. He would cry and Green Goblin would beat him from an inch of his life in front of Aunt May. We cut to the morning and Norman would rush in panic, telling Harry what had happened. Peter and Aunt May were almost beaten to death at night and he would scream saying what happened and he would say that they were at the hospital. Harry would slowly get his things and he would yell at his father, telling him who did this, what was going on, and Norman would tell Harry Peter had a shift at 9 a.m. but he didn't arrive, and the police would tell him what happened and they would give Norman the breaking news, and Norman quickly rushed to get Harry. Harry would tell his dad he would be out in a minute. Harry would panic and he would put his Spider-Man costume underneath his clothes. He knew that he had to take revenge on whoever or what did this, and he knew it had to be the Goblin. He had to finish the Goblin off once and for all. Harry would walk into the room seeing Peter and Aunt May in the hospital beds. MJ would be holding Peter's hand and Norman would slowly have a weird smirk. He would smile and he would walk away, leaving the room. Harry would look to see his dad was gone and he couldn't even believe it. He would yell and he would look both ways from the hall, but nobody was there. He had just disappeared. Harry would rush into the room telling MJ his father left, and MJ would tell Harry to calm down and sit with her. He would take a seat and he would start looking at Peter and his aunt. He knew if he could do one good thing for Peter, it was to track down and end the Green Goblin once and for all. That was the least he could do for his friend. MJ would try taking Harry's hand, but Harry would tell her to stop, and he would get up from his seat and he would say, "How could you?" and he would end up leaving the room. Harry would say, "You chose your path and I'm not interested." Harry would pick up the phone, phoning his father. Harry would hear nothing, but then he would hear laughing in the phone, asking if Spidey wanted to play one last time. The Goblin would say his father was tied up somewhere and that he didn't have much time. Norman would scream on the phone and Green Goblin would start laughing, saying that he was on the bridge and that for him to meet him there. Green Goblin would use his glider to blow up parts near the bridge and Harry would run out of the alleyway, ripping his clothes off, jumping into action as Spider-Man. He would see screaming and fire in the distance. He knew this was going to get personal, and he knew the Green Goblin knows his secret, and maybe his dad finally knows, but there was no time to think about that. He had to stop this once and for all. Spider-Man would swing there, running, wall crawling, going wall to wall, getting to the bridge as fast as he could. He would get to the bridge in time. He could see that the Green Goblin had somebody. It was Bernard. He would have him by his neck, telling Spider-Man if he comes any closer, these kids and the old fool would be dropped and sent to their deaths. Spider-Man would yell, saying to let them go, just like the original timeline. Green Goblin would say lines about choices, and he would drop Bernard and the children. Spider-Man would catch both of them, saving them in time, and it would almost play out the same, but this time it wasn't MJ that was being held, it was Bernard. The city would help Spider-Man, and they would start throwing stuff at the Green Goblin. If they mess with one of us, they mess with all of us. Spider-Man in time would save them all, and Bernard would look at Spider-Man, and Spider-Man would demand, telling him where Norman Osborn was, and he would look at him, saying that he thinks Norman might be, until Green Goblin would catch Spider-Man with the hook, and it would hit him, going into his shoulder. Spider-Man would be sent into the warehouse, crashing into walls, and he would fall onto the ground. Spider-Man would try crawling up, trying to get to his feet, and Green Goblin would tell Spider-Man Norman was dead, and that he finally destroyed him alongside Peter and his stupid aunt. Green Goblin would tell Spider-Man he should have chosen a different path, and that it wasn't too late for him to join him. He would extend his hand out to Spider-Man, and Spider-Man would crawl up, getting to his feet, saying he was going to pay for everything he did to him and his friends. Green Goblin would punch him over and over again, and he would rip Spider-Man's mask off, saying he was weak and that he was always going to be weak. Green Goblin would use a pumpkin bomb and he would throw it at him, blowing it up right into his face. Green Goblin said once he finishes him, he's going to go after Peter, his aunt, and that stupid girl MJ. Harry would keep shouting no, and he would get back up. Green Goblin would yell impossible, and Harry would dodge attacks, and he would launch his arms into the Green Goblin's shoulders. He would fall to his knees. Harry would take his hands, crushing them as hard as he could, and Green Goblin would tell him to stop. He would say, "Harry, stop, please," and he would go on, and Harry was just about to finish the job off until he could see into his broken mask of the Green Goblin, and he would rip it off of him. everything. Harry would tear up looking at what he was seeing. It was his father. He would scream, saying it was impossible, this couldn't be true, and he knew that it was. Norman would tell Harry it was the Goblin and that he had nothing to do with it. He would tell Harry to take his hand and that they both could rule the city once and for all. Harry would tell him he lost his mind, and now after everything, things were starting to add up. The glider, the suit, the stolen equipment, Oscorp, he knew it. It was all true. Norman would tell Harry if he could add this up, and Harry's spider sense would go off, and he would do a backflip, and the glider would go into Norman's gut, and Norman would scream in pain. Harry would scream no, telling Norman what the heck is going on? What did he do? Norman would tell Harry that he was sorry for everything, and then he would drop to the ground, dead. Harry would cry looking into the Goblin mask, and he could see his father's dead, lifeless body. Harry would look at his hands. Did he just kill his father? No, he didn't kill his father. He killed the Goblin. Harry would be crying, and he would pick up his half-burned mask, and he would put it back on. He would rip the glider off of his father, and his father would collapse to the ground, lifeless. Harry would carry his body to the Osborn residence house. Bernard would see Spider-Man, and Spider-Man would lay his body down on the couch, and he would throw the Goblin mask at the table, and Bernard would look at it. He would run out of the room as fast as possible. Peter and Aunt May would recover. Harry would have a funeral for his father, and he almost didn't go to it because of what happened, and he knew he couldn't tell anyone about what was going on or that he was Spider-Man. Peter would walk up to Harry, and Harry would say to Peter, Spider-Man finished the Green Goblin off once and for all. Peter would say that he was sorry for his loss, and Harry would say to Peter, Norman was the Green Goblin. My father was the Green Goblin. Peter would ask how he knew of all this, and he would say that Spider-Man ended up telling him everything. Peter would look at the grave of his Uncle Ben, and he would say that he was sorry to hear that, and Peter would tell Harry he swears on his uncle's grave Spider-Man would pay, and he would tell Harry you should think the same way as well, and he would walk away. Harry would take Peter's shoulder just before he was about to leave, and he would tell him that he was sorry about everything, and he was sorry that his father put him through all of this stuff, and Peter couldn't even believe the news, and he would tell Harry that he needs time to think things through, and they would part ways at the funeral. MJ would tell Harry that if he ever needed somebody, that she would be here for him, and Harry would say thank you, and he would end up leaving, doing one final swing in the city, and that's where we're going to end part 1 of the series of the Osborn Saga. Spider-Man 2 and 3 will be happening for What If Harry Osborn Got Bit by the Spider. Let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of this long-awaited fan fiction, and if you guys did enjoy this video, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn your notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. But anyways, as always guys, thanks for tuning in, and have a fantastic day.